as you can probably expect, with this kind of finding where two-thirds of people are shocking somebody and potentially, even at least as far as they know, potentially killing somebody, obviously, this is something that Milgram wanted to explore. And so, after the initial study, he looked at some of the different conditions that might have led people to engage in more obedience to authority versus less obedience to authority. So, first of all, this original study was done with men. This was done at the Yale University campus, which is probably pretty intimidating for people. And additionally, there are other aspects, such as that you can't see the person that you're potentially shocking. And the experimenter is very authoritative and has a lab coat. So Milgram did a bunch of follow-up experiments to see what sort of things would enhance obedience and what sort of things would decrease obedience. So it turns out that when people are given absolutely no commands, they tend to not exhibit full obedience. They don't do the full level of shocks. The original baseline study at Yale found that about two-thirds of male participants will engage in full obedience. They'll go to the full 450 shocks. It turns out that women will do the same. So occasionally I get a student who says, well, what about women? Women are more nurturing. No, women are socialized and believed to be more nurturing, but they will exhibit full obedience just like men will. Now, if you switch the setting from Yale University, which is prestigious and intimidating, to a regular office building, you get less obedience. You only get about 45% that comply. When there is an ordinary person in charge rather than an experimenter, you only get a little less than 20% obedience. When the experimenter is in a remote location and he's giving orders to you over a telephone, you get about 20% obedience. Though part of me is curious as to whether people were lying on the phone to the experimenter. Yeah, no, I just shocked him right now. You heard that, right? Like, I really for real did that. When the victim is in the same room as the participant, you can see that obedience drops from the baseline level, but it's still pretty high. It's about 40%. When you actually have to touch the victim to shock them, so you have to take their hand and put it on a shock plate, it drops to about 30%. But the conditions under which you will get the least amount of obedience is when you have two other Confederates in the room with you that choose to not obey. So if two other people rebel, you will be more likely to rebel. So we tend to find that we'll be less likely to obey an authority figure when other people around us are not obeying. So this leads to a question. So we know that obedience and authority figures can affect our behavior. Can the presence of being in a group also affect our behavior? And it turns out that they can. There are some things that when you do them in front of a group of people, you tend to find that you perform the task better. And this is what's known as social facilitation. If you're around other people, you might actually perform a little bit better than you would if you were performing alone. So if you've ever heard of the concept of a home court or a home field advantage, we tend to find that sports teams will play better when they're on their home turf in front of fans that support them. I tend to find that when I play for wind ensemble, I play much better in a concert than I do when I'm in a rehearsal. When I'm in theater, I tend to perform a bit better when I'm in front of other people than when I am just having a rehearsal. And you'll probably find that that's the case for you too. You might actually perform certain tasks better when you're in the presence of other people. Now, on the other hand, we also know that the presence of other people makes us more inclined to slack off. And this is what's known as social loafing. So we tend to find that when you're in the presence of a group, you will than you would if you were on your own. What you're looking at here on this graph are people who are either cheering or they're clapping. So these people have headphones put on that either simulates a group of one, two, four, or six people clapping and cheering. What you're looking at here is the loudness of clapping and cheering on the y-axis. So what this graph shows you is that when you are the only one clapping or you are the only one cheering, you tend to do that a bit more loudly. As more people are clapping and cheering, so as the group size increases from 2 to 4 to 6, people start to become more quiet. They cheer less loudly. They clap less loudly because other people around them are doing it too. So social loafing kind of creates a bit of a diffusion of responsibility. Now, I want you to briefly imagine if you could be invisible for 24 hours, what sort of things would you do? Would you go spy on people? Would you prank people? Would you make people believe that ghosts are real? Would you do a lot of different illegal things? One of the things that we find is that this is kind of related to the concept of de-individuation. So if you're in a really, really large group, like you're watching a football game or you're at a concert or things like that. One of the things that can kind of happen is because you're in such a large group, you don't really have a sense of self awareness. You kind of blend into the crowd. And so, one of the things we find is, especially in situations where arousal is heightened, especially if you have the sense that people can't see you. So if you're wearing something like a mask or a disguise or anything like that, we actually find that people will engage in behaviors that they otherwise would not do. So one of the ways you can kind of see this, I want you to imagine you're at a big football game and it's an exciting football game. It is your favorite team. They really need to win this game, and then they do, and you're really excited. There's everybody around you, they're excited and happy, and people start taking to the football field to tear down the goalpost. Now, ordinarily, tearing down a goalpost is not something that you would do. You can get in trouble for that. But because there are so many people around you doing the same thing, arousal is high, there's a pretty good chance you won't be identified because the group is so large. You're a lot more likely to have no self restraint. So you might join in and tear down that goalpost. Sporting riots, this kind of thing tends to happen. Even the anonymity of places like the internet and different forum groups, especially if you do not have to use your real name and you can use like a pseudonym or a nickname or something like that, we tend to find that people say things and do things that they would otherwise not do if they could be identified. So, when groups interact with each other, the other thing that we have to watch out for is group polarization. So, we tend to hang around people that are a lot like us and believe what we believe. And one of the things that we find is that when people discuss ideas and beliefs with other people that share those beliefs, what we tend to find is that their opinion, the strength of their opinion increases. So here we've got group one who is against something, group two that is for something, and then they discuss with each other. Now, notice there's a lot of people that are kind of near the center. After a group discussion, we actually tend to find that the center no longer exists. There aren't people that are in the middle or are moderate. We have the people who are against are even more strongly against, and the people who are for are even more for that than they were. So oftentimes we will find that we get more and more polarized just by talking to other people who believe what we believe. And it's part of the reason you're starting to hear more and more talk about the importance of getting outside of bubbles. Because when you're in a bubble, you spend a lot of time talking with people who think what you think and believe what you believe. And those things are really important. But over time, we find that if we stick to our bubbles, that we become more entrenched and far more polarized. Um, and we can't really have good interactions with people who do not agree with us. So it's important to really expose yourself to ideas that you don't necessarily agree with. So we tend to find, for example, if you have high prejudice groups and low prejudice groups, before they had a discussion, you can see that the high prejudice groups were pretty high prejudice, and then the low prejudice groups were pretty low prejudice. And then after discussion, the high prejudice groups became even more prejudiced, the low prejudice groups became even less prejudiced. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. So that is really all I had. Take some time to listen to this if you can, and we will start talking about psychological disorders on Friday.